Well, hello, everyone. Good to see you again. I'm Anne-Marie Green.
And I'm Vladimir Duterte. Thanks for joining us. We begin this hour in Washington, where another busy week of depositions is expected as House Democrats push forward with their impeachment inquiry into President Trump. The biggest name on this week's list is acting U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor. Lawmakers want to hear from Taylor after they obtained dozens of text messages between him and the U.S. Ambassador to the EU. That's Gordon Sondland. Their conversation centered around U.S. dealings with that country. Now, in one exchange last month, Taylor tells Sondland, quote, "I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign." This comes as acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney faces growing backlash for his on-camera admission of a potential quid pro quo. He's also managing the fallout after announcing next year's G7 will take place at one of the president's properties, an idea President Trump ditched over the weekend.
Paula Reid reports from the White House.
I still think I'm doing a pretty good job as the Chief of Staff, and I think the President agrees.
Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney insisted Sunday he is not stepping down.
Absolutely, positively not.
In an administration known for upheaval, Mulvaney's role seems less certain after an explosive press conference last Thursday.
Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy.
Mulvaney undermined the president's impeachment defense by confirming a quid pro quo in why aid to Ukraine was held up.
3 issues for that: the corruption in the country, whether or not other countries were participating in the support of the Ukraine, and whether or not they were cooperating in an ongoing investigation with our Department of Justice.
I'll leave to the Chief of Staff to explain what it is he said and what he intended.
Mulvaney recanted his statement, but his performance exemplified how the White House has failed to offer a coherent defense against the impeachment inquiry.
If you held up the money for 3 reasons, that's a quid pro quo.
I'm not acknowledging there's 3 reasons. Again, let's go back.
You said 3 reasons.
Go back to I recognize that. Go back to what actually happened in the real world.
Mulvaney's name has also emerged in the impeachment inquiry itself. A former presidential advisor testified that Mulvaney worked with the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, on a rogue operation involving Ukraine. Mulvaney's quid pro quo admission last week wasn't the only thing Republicans were having a hard time defending. It was also the president's decision to award himself a huge contract by hosting next year's G7 summit at his hotel in Florida.
This just creates more controversy that, quite frankly, we don't need right now.
Mr. Trump was not expecting Republicans to criticize the decision, and in a rare move, he reversed course on Saturday night.
So Paula Reid is joining us now from the White House. So let us talk about that rare reversal. How is the White House explaining why they decided now to no longer host the G7 summit at the President's own golf club?
Well, Anne-Marie, officially the White House is deferring to the president's tweet from Saturday night, where he said because of hostility from the media and Democrats, he would no longer consider his own property for the next G7. But since when does bad press or criticism from the opposing party force the president to cave? It appears that this was indeed a political calculation, because this isn't the first time this idea had been floated. Of course, the president first floated the idea of using his Florida resort at the G7 in August. And at that time, senior White House officials told me there's no way he would have said that publicly unless it had already been vetted by the attorneys. They said they weren't worried about violating laws, prohibiting the president from taking money from foreign officials, or even ethics concerns. But it appears now, at this moment, when the president is losing support from his own party on issues like Syria and needs their support on issues like the impeachment inquiry, he just could not afford to alienate them on something like this.
It's interesting, Paula, the president is blaming the media, he's blaming Democrats when your reporting and others points to the fact that the president already knew that he was going to take some heat from Democrats for this decision and was prepared to take on that heat. What he was not prepared for were the Republicans, who finally said, look, you're taking our support of you and your policies and your actions for granted.
Exactly. It's too much. It's too far. There's just not enough bandwidth right now to support the president in so many battles and so many theaters of war. And right now, he's really focused on the impeachment inquiry and not wanting to alienate any members of his own party over something like the location of the G7.
So let us talk about Mulvaney now and his public admission of a quid pro quo, and then his backpedaling on that it wasn't that. And in fact, you know, he sort of didn't use that exact phrase, but he was asked outright what you're describing is a quid pro quo, and he sort of fumbled through that answer. A lot of people heard that, and they thought, wonder if he's going to be subpoenaed, because I think the Democrats might want to talk to him. Does this play into the impeachment inquiry in any way?
Oh, absolutely. Saying that there was indeed a quid pro quo and then telling people to get over it, and that's just the way things are done, that completely undercuts the White House's defense strategy against this impeachment inquiry. Now, Democrats have been criticized for hearing so many witnesses behind closed doors so that the public isn't really privy to a lot of this evidence except what leaks. But here, Democrats had the best witness imaginable on national television. And if you look at the transcript of that press conference, it's not like Mulvaney got tripped up or someone's parsing his words. He was asked repeatedly, and he doubled down, insisting that, yes, there was a quid pro quo and that, yes, aid was withheld contingent upon Ukraine cooperating in a Justice Department investigation. I mean, while he did try to retract this statement, something like this is incredibly valuable for Democrats as they go forward. Even if it doesn't lead to the removal of the president in the court of public opinion, it certainly raises the kind of questions that they want people to be asking.
And yet, Paula, the White House, Mr. Mulvaney, you had the Secretary of State, others essentially sort of doubling down in some ways on those comments, either saying, look, let the words, the clarification is what they're calling it, but it's not really a clarification. He was very clear when he was sitting in that White House press briefing room as to what he was saying. And so the question I have, I guess, is what kind of a legal jeopardy does that put Mick Mulvaney in? Presumably, he's aware of these conversations the president has had, not just with Zelensky, but with other world leaders. So if they even decide to remove him, that's some of the reporting out there that there had been talk about possibly replacing him. What would that potentially mean legally?
Well, legally, he needs to get his story straight before he testifies before Congress. While it's not a crime to speak in error before the public or before the press, you have to have your facts straight before you are a witness before Congress, and certainly before you ever talk to any federal investigators, if it ever came to that. So legally, that's the jeopardy that he faces. But we're also concerned here today at the White House about whether or not we're going to have another high-profile departure from the White House. So CBS News has learned top White House officials who used to work here say, look, the knives are out for Mulvaney. There are questions about how secure he is. But as you just noted, there are kind of mixed messages coming out of the White House here. So he's recanting it, but other officials are doubling down. The Trump campaign completely embracing Mulvaney's messaging. In fact, printing up T-shirts with his signature phrase, get over it.
So, throughout this whole inquiry process, we've seen Republicans leave the room and sort of mimic the president's words and rail against the process, not the allegations, but the process, and, call it a kangaroo court and amongst other things. But now we're hearing that in an interview for Axios on HBO, Senator Lindsey Graham, a very vocal supporter of the president, said that he would be open to impeachment, but only if there is evidence as to what he considers a quid pro quo. He's a huge supporter of the president. What are we to make of this?
Well, it's not great news for the president that Lindsey Graham is not completely closing the door, but it's political speak here, right? He's saying, I would be open if there was evidence of a crime. And he's already been clear that he does not believe what transpired between the president and his Ukrainian counterpart was a quid pro quo or was illegal. He also brushed off any suggestion that the president was pressuring China. He said that was, quote, just the president being very frustrated. So it appears that based on what he knows now, he doesn't consider any of this a crime. So it's very easy for him to come out and say, well, if there was evidence of a crime, certainly I'd be open to impeachment. But if he doesn't see that yet, it doesn't appear that the president has really lost one of his closest allies on this issue, even though Lindsey Graham last week was quite vocal about his opposition to the president's decision to abruptly withdraw troops from northern Syria.
All right, Paula Reid, we didn't even ask you about Syria.
So
but
much
there's
that
so
happened
much
over
to
the
going
weekend.
on. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but thank you so much, Paula.